Not long ago, a new planet called Red Moon appeared in the solar system. Humanity geared up to reach it because it had a valuable mineral called Lumia. This mineral was all the rage because it had hyper-energy, making all other energy sources on Earth obsolete. But everything changed when Red Moon altered its course and began to head straight for Earth. A collision between the two planets would mean the end of humanity. Furthermore, Red Moon had a protective magnetic field that was impenetrable. Only one astronaut, Paul, had the experience necessary to traverse that field. However, just hours before the mission to Red Moon was to begin, Paul disappeared without a trace. Meanwhile, Paul was in a desolate part of France facing a colossal wall. The arid plains stretched out before him, and he couldn't get a persistent voice out of his head telling him to seek the truth. As a child, a ray from Red Moon had struck him, giving him the ability to hear people's thoughts and read their minds. But this power came at a price. It caused constant tremors in his hands. To help him, his father, Henry, had developed a special medicine. Although the ecological catastrophe was imminent, Paul was hesitant to destroy Red Moon because of his unique perspective. Inside the wall, Paul approached a local resident and asked him for a couple of taxis, making sure they weren't under surveillance. The man took him to his garage and offered him a fully charged flying car that could last for months. Paul was eager to accept this offer, as he needed transportation for his journey outside the compound. The owner of the car couldn't believe his eyes. No one had gone beyond the protective wall in 14 years. Unbeknownst to them, a surveillance drone was spying on them. And in a second, it identified Paul as the astronaut the authorities were looking for. But Paul was lucky. He took off just before the cops arrived at the garage. As he continued on his way, Paul heard on the news that humanity only had 7 days before the apocalypse. Most people were taking advantage of their last moments with their families, and the large reward for finding Paul didn't motivate many to look for him. On his journey, Paul heard the voice of a woman in his head telling him to find a forest that he knew from childhood and had drawn many times. But then, his car ran out of energy. He realized that the guy he had spoken to earlier had tricked him. With no other option, he had to push his car to the nearest service station to buy a new Lumia battery. There, he met Elma, a girl who worked in the store. Elma told Paul that he would have to wait 3 days for the battery to arrive. Meanwhile, on TV, the news said that Paul was still missing and that humanity's last hope was in a spaceship called Aurora, commanded by Paul's older brother, Elliot. Elliot was on a crucial mission and had managed to break through Red Moon's protective magnetic field. But he soon realized the ship was going too fast, so he urgently asked Mission Control to abort the mission. Unfortunately, his request was denied, and a catastrophic disaster became unavoidable. The Aurora ship, under Elliot's command, burst into flames and finally exploded, leaving Paul in a state of shock and utter devastation. Trying to regain his composure, he left the store area and stumbled upon an old magazine that showed a senior official from the French Space Agency who happened to be his father. This brought back painful memories of the last time he saw his mother, who later succumbed to a mysterious illness. Meanwhile, Elma, who was in her room, saw a report on TV about the search for the astronaut who had been closest to landing on Red Moon. She realized that the man who had bought the battery from her was, in fact, the wanted astronaut. Arming herself with a weapon, she set out to leave. Although her father briefly stopped her, warning her about the dangers of the outside world, it was evident that their relationship was strained. However, Elma, determined, approached Paul to confirm if he was the astronaut in question and asked to join his journey. Deep down, Elma harbored a strong desire to explore the world before Earth's fatal collision with the Red Moon. Nevertheless, Paul immediately rejected her request, worried that his fugitive status could endanger Elma's life. Meanwhile, in an unknown location, the remaining fragments of the Aurora ship suddenly landed on Earth, carrying a still-alive Elliot inside. After receiving medical attention, the doctors made an astonishing discovery. Elliot's contact with the Lumia on the Red Moon had caused an extraordinary genetic mutation, allowing him to come back to life after being dead for an hour. Even more surprisingly, Elliot now possessed extraordinary powers that allowed him to delve into the thoughts of others. Then, Elliot, almost recovered, grabs the phone and calls his old man. He wants permission to launch a mission and find Paul. On the other hand, Elma is playing with her sniper rifle when, suddenly, several officers arrive looking for Paul. Elma is alerted, but Paul, quicker than them, hides in a water tank and dodges them. After that scare, Elma tries to return to her room, but Sass discovers that her dad has set it on fire. That move hurts her soul because she kept all the memories of her deceased mother there. But it turns out that the old man had his reasons. He wanted Elma to leave those ties behind and prepare to explore the world before the Earth goes to hell, hoping to reunite with her mother one last time. The next day, Elliot arrives at the store where Paul had been recently. Elma's father, who knows Paul's whereabouts, tries to play dumb and denies knowing anything. But Elliot, with his new mind-reading abilities, realizes the lie instantly. And, as if that weren't enough, Elliot discovers that he can mentally manipulate Elma's father, forcing him to do the unthinkable. Elma, seeing all the drama from a window, screams in horror and tries to escape from Elliot, who, although he cannot run, deploys a spider-shaped robot to track her down. Meanwhile, Paul manages to steal a Lumia battery from Elliot's vehicle and continues on his way in his car. On the road, he sees Elma sitting on the edge and, moved, lets her into his car, driving away together into the unknown. During the trip, Paul tells Elma that he will only have her with him for a day. After that, they will separate because Paul's mission is super dangerous and he doesn't want Elma to get hurt. After hours behind the wheel, they stopped at a restaurant. Paul tried to call his father to confirm if Elliot had indeed disappeared. Henry assured him that Elliot was fine and continued to insist that he return to his astronaut duties to save the world from the impending apocalypse. Suddenly, an officer appeared with a gun pointed at Paul, ready to arrest him. Paul tried to resist, but the officer was wearing armor and his efforts were useless. Luckily, with Elma's help, they managed to escape and sped away from the restaurant. As they continued their journey, Elma reassured Paul that without her help, he could have been captured. In return, Elma demanded that he tell her about his past. With no other option, Paul began to talk about his childhood, marked by inexplicable visions. In those days, his father's space project was going swimmingly, allowing humanity to extract Lumia minerals from the Red Moon. However, Paul felt that what they were doing was wrong, and he couldn't explain the purpose of his visions. In the end, he discovered that the approach of the Red Moon and its effects on Earth were not an isolated event. He had tried to show his father what he had discovered and warn him about approaching the Red Moon. Unfortunately, Paul was ignored time and time again because the scientists believed they could predict the trajectory of the Red Moon. In the end, their predictions failed, and it was too late. Paul believed that the appearance of the Red Moon was intended to protect the Earth from something beyond human understanding, and that destroying it would lead to the destruction of Earth. Meanwhile, in another corner of the universe, Elliot was in the same restaurant that Paul had visited before, trying to pry information from the owner. He found out that Paul was with a young woman. Once he had all the necessary details, Elliot used his twisted mind to harm the restaurant owner, forcing her to do something unthinkable. Meanwhile, Paul and Elma were resting in their car, enjoying the fresh air. Paul showed Elma a photo of a forest that he carried with him and explained that his long journey aimed to find that place, believing that the key to understanding Brad Moon's true intentions lay there. The next day, Paul and Elma continued on their way, but suddenly, another car started chasing them. In addition, they ran into a gigantic red dust storm that blocked their path, and things were looking pretty ugly. Despite the danger, Paul had no choice but to drive straight into the storm to escape his pursuers. It was then that Paul saw a spider-shaped robot following them, realizing that it was the reason why they always knew where they were. After destroying the robot, Paul stopped the car and sought refuge in an abandoned cinema with Elma while they waited for the storm to pass. Paul played a recorded film that showed various animals and plants in France just before a major extinction event occurred. Among the images, a video of a forest appeared that made Paul realize it was the same forest he had been searching for. This revelation left him feeling disappointed and foolish for having hoped to find a forest that was now a desert. The next day, Elma woke Paul in a state of extreme panic. They found themselves surrounded by officers acting under Elliot's orders. In a desperate attempt to escape, Paul pretended to use Elma as a hostage, but the officers didn't hesitate and started shooting, accidentally wounding Elma in the stomach. Despite the injury, they managed to reach the car and sped away. Meanwhile, Elliot, determined not to lose sight of Paul, immediately launched into pursuit. In the middle of the journey, the car radio announced a checkpoint a few meters away, and Paul went into a growing panic. Elma, with her last strength, made some quick adjustments to the car, surprisingly making it take off. Elliot's car could also fly. To make matters worse, Elliot accelerated in the air and collided with Paul's car. All three survived the crash. Paul got out of the car immediately and pointed his gun at Elliot. Elliot, with his special abilities, tried to convince Paul to continue his mission to destroy Red Moon and save the world. But Paul, more determined than ever, thought about doing the unthinkable with his weapon. He remembered his promise to Elma to take her south to find her mother, which stopped him from pulling the trigger. Instead, he shot Elliot in the head. After the confrontation, Paul carried the wounded Elma and began to walk looking for medical help. They arrived at a desert where his late mother was buried. It was once a beautiful beach behind Paul's house, but climate change turned it into a dry desert. Stumbling upon his childhood book, Paul was located by the authorities, leaving him no choice but to carry out his mission so he could ask his father for a medical team to treat Elma's wounds. It wasn't long before Paul put on his astronaut suit and quickly boarded a spaceship armed with a nuclear bomb, heading towards Red Moon. Paul knew the terrain of the Red Moon well and skillfully navigated the magnetic field without damaging the spacecraft. Just as he was about to reach the surface, Paul had a change of heart, cut off communication with Central Command, and redirected his ship away from the magnetic field. Meanwhile, Elma had been rescued and learned of Paul's trip to the Red Moon. As she exited the ambulance, she looked to the sky hoping that Paul would return safely from his mission. In addition, Elma found a childhood book of Paul's filled with peculiar drawings he had created. As she turned the pages, she noticed that some of the drawings seemed to predict future events. One of the pages showed a rocket moving away from the Red Moon. When Elma looked up, she saw how Paul's rocket deliberately exploded, creating a shockwave that pushed the Red Moon away from Earth. Grief-stricken, Elma turned to the next page, which showed children under umbrellas. Upon reaching for a nearby umbrella, it miraculously started to rain, soaking the land with a rainfall she hadn't seen since her childhood. The film came to an end. The lesson of the story is that sometimes it's better to follow your heart and protect your loved ones, even if it means going against the mission. And don't forget that the answers to life's mysteries can be found in the pages of a childhood book.